spoiler warning for Metroid Dread, Resident Evil Village, and Uncharted 4. Also, content warning. We don't go into too much detail, but we do touch on some more serious topics. So, something kind of amazing happened to me recently. I finally beat the final boss of Metroid Dread. Okay, well, the game's been out for a hot minute, but this is kind of a big deal for me. I can't think of many instances in recent memory where I've actually played a newer game all the way through to completion. The last time I beat a newer game was Resident Evil Village roughly a year ago, and before that, it was my bajillionth playthrough of Resident Evils 2 and 3 Remake. Before that, it was Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PS5, and before that, it was Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal in 2020. Rarely do I beat more than about 2 to 3 brand new games a year, max. And yet, I keep buying the latest and greatest games everyone's talking about, getting part of the way through the main campaign, and just sort of losing interest or forgetting that I own the game. And the next time I want to play something, I spend hours staring at a menu full of tiles wondering how I got to this point in my life. I bought a PS5 at launch, and the damn thing gets used on and off so much that it went 3 whole months without ever being used at one point. I feel like somebody's gonna come by and revoke my gamer card. And the issue gets worse the more I look at all the games that are coming up, and I see how excited people are for these games, and I just don't feel very much. What happened to me? Well, the thing is, I'm not entirely alone in this situation. Over on my community tab, I recently ran a poll where I asked my subscribers how many games they had finished within the last 12 months, and the vast majority were in the ballpark of 1 to 6 games, with 3 to 6 being the most popular choice, and less than 20% saying that they had completed 7 or more games. For context, the vast majority had a completion rate of anywhere from 1 game every 2 months to 1 game every 12 months, and I was kind of vague on criteria, so multiple playthroughs of older games were more than likely included in this data as well. This does not at all reflect the majority of the gaming community, but taking this poll into consideration, plus the many other videos addressing the dreaded gaming backlog, it's clear that this is an issue that affects a significant chunk of people who play video games. I was inspired to make this video because of a recent influx of tweets and discourse that I've seen where people are saying that gaming has lost its magic, at least for them. This is a bit of a scary dilemma, one that I myself seem to have fallen victim to, despite how amazing and exciting so many upcoming games do look. So, how did those of us in this situation get to this point, and is there anything we can do about it? Well, let's take a deep dive into why a lot of us rarely finish games, why it feels like gaming has lost its magic, and what, if anything, we can do about this.
The game is fun. If it's not fun, why bother?
Part 1. Finding the time. Ever since I was old enough to push buttons with my little fingies, I've been playing video games. There was a certain magic to the experience that blew me away in my early years, even with games that sucked. As soon as I was old enough to know how to use the internet, if I wasn't playing games, I was on YouTube watching other people talk about and play video games. Many unspecified years have passed since then, so I'm an adult now. Apparently. Gotta say, I don't recommend it. But now that I'm here, I have very little in terms of free time. For many millennials and elder Gen Zs living in countries like the US where hourly wages rarely support the cost of living, many will have to dedicate nearly all of their time to supporting themselves financially. And the result is both a lack of free time and a lack of disposable income to spend on things that won't necessarily help you reach your goal of settling down and maybe possibly owning a house one day. While I was a university student pursuing my film degree, I felt this immense pressure to not only succeed in my classes, but to do more. To join clubs, network with other filmmakers, and to use my free time to work on other film-related projects. I would feel this guilt whenever I would sit down to play a game. Like I was wasting valuable time that I should be using to get ahead of everyone else trying to achieve the same things. Now that I've graduated, things haven't gotten much better. Working a full-time job, taking freelance work on the side, and trying to build up a YouTube channel which not that long ago only had a few dozen subscribers, it doesn't leave much time to play video games for fun. But of course, not having the time to do things is one of those situations that just kind of affects every working adult. So what else is going on? In today's media-driven world, it's a lot more than just games competing for what limited free time any of us has. There's also the dozens of streaming services with hit shows that everyone's talking about, wonderful creators on YouTube that are fun to watch, and doing things like exercising and cooking and cleaning. So basically, there's never any shortage of other things vying for your attention. And I'm a childless Zillennial. I can only imagine what it's like for people who do have children and have a lot of other commitments, a mortgage, just other adult things. In the era of the internet and social media, there's a certain pressure to engage with the media that everyone else is talking about. When a big new game drops that a bunch of people are interested in, you kind of feel a certain urge to be a part of the conversation and to play that game and see what the fuss is all about. I specifically remember when Kingdom Hearts 3 came out. I bought the all-in-one collection and played through most of the games so that I'd be prepped for the third game. A game which I dropped about halfway through, and I never finished either of the first two games. Instead, dropping those most of the way through and watching plot summaries on YouTube so I wouldn't be lost. I mean, I still was, but I was along for the ride anyway. I didn't really enjoy any of the games in this series as much as I hoped I would, but I kept pressuring myself to play more and more, hoping that this series would click for me. Cause I love Kingdom Hearts conceptually. I'm a big fan of Disney's animated films, and I had a trip to Disneyland planned for later that year, so I also wanted to be a part of the community of people playing and talking about this game while it was new. I didn't want to be that person that got the entire Kingdom Hearts saga and didn't like it, but in the end, that's just kind of what happened. I forced myself to play a game that I just wasn't feeling, and there was a certain guilt associated with that. I just had to accept the fact that this game that everyone else was loving and enjoying just wasn't for me as much as I wanted to love it. And that's totally fine. Not every game is going to appeal to everyone, and yet there's this persistent pressure to be a part of the conversation. When you have access to the rest of the world at the touch of your fingertips, that's kind of what inevitably happens. More recently, I felt something kind of similar with Elden Ring. I have no interest in Soulsborne games whatsoever. I tried Bloodborne, I tried the first Dark Souls, did not particularly like those games, personally. They're just not for me, and I've accepted that. But seeing all this discourse around Elden Ring has made me second guess that. I feel weird not liking this franchise given how many people like it and how theoretically it should fall into the wheelhouse of stuff that I do enjoy. And when I'm left out of conversations surrounding the game, I feel like I'm not truly a real gamer. Though I know labels like that are stupid and don't really mean anything, whatever. It kind of left me with imposter syndrome. And when it comes to just liking media, that's all really stupid and arbitrary. People are three-dimensional, but our desire to fit into a group and to be a part of conversations makes it hard to reconcile the fact that sometimes we don't like things that other people do like, and sometimes we love things that most people hate. This pressure to constantly try new games and to have more new games under your belt and build up that gamer cred is one of the big things that leads to me adding to my backlog unnecessarily and just leads to me owning games that I never touch. And then when the time rolls around for me to go through my games and pick something new to try out, I'm presented with so many choices that making a decision can often be extremely difficult. So these are the things that flood my brain the moment I sit down and contemplate which of my consoles I should turn on. There's also a lot of unnecessary stigma around how games should be played. Gatekeeping within the gaming community can be pretty detrimental to some enjoying the simple act of playing video games. If you play Animal Crossing, you're not allowed to fast forward the clock to make things happen faster. You can't play Scrimbomic JRPG game on easy mode. You can't use save states or rewind features on the Switch Virtual Console, etc., etc. It just keeps going. And you know, we're just getting started.
I think they're excited.
Part 2. The Absence of Childlike Wonder. So for this section, I'd like to start off with a little bit of a personal anecdote. Back in 2017, gaming was pretty dang good. The Nintendo Switch had just come out and it was the new hotness, and I was eagerly anticipating the release of Super Mario Odyssey. This game was a return to form for Chris Pratt Jr., and it was exactly the kind of Mario game that I wanted after Super Mario 3D World. I blasted through the game in about 4 days, and after the credits rolled, I was presented with all this optional content that I intended on playing and never did. I walked away from my Super Mario Odyssey experience revering the game and praising its return to form, but it wasn't an experience that left much of an impact on me. And in all honesty, I haven't felt the urge to return to the game since then, which sucks because I love Mario, but this wasn't really the end of this particular situation. Flash forward a few years to 2020, and I excitedly picked up the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection, looking at the game as an excuse to revisit 3 classic games that I loved from my childhood. Portable Mario Galaxy would have fried my young brain, so I knew I had to fulfill this longtime childhood desire. I got all 120 stars in Mario 64, did the same for Galaxy, got to the final boss and did nothing more in Sunshine, and I generally enjoyed revisiting these games. But how do I put this? I kind of just felt like I was going through the motions. Like I was playing the games not because I was in the mood to play some classic Mario games, but because I needed to cross them off a checklist before I felt like I could return to my backlog and slowly chip away at yet another game. At this point, I was thinking to myself, do I just not like 3D Mario anymore? Okay. Take a breath of the wild. Looking back to when I was a child playing these games for the first time, a lot of things were different. As a child, your experiences are a lot more limited. Pretty much everything is new and exciting. Even garbage doo-doo games. During my earliest gaming years, I had a GameCube, and the only games that I owned for the Purple Flip box were cheap licensed games. I'm talking Jimmy Neutron, Fairly Oddparents, King Kong, Monsters Inc., the stupid dodgeball video game, I hated this one. 007 Everything or Nothing, which was actually pretty decent. And Casper Spirit Dimensions, which I used to consider my favorite game as a child. I don't know what was wrong with me. The GameCube was well known for its collection of banger titles, but I never had access to any of the games that everyone else remembers from the generation, and yet I was happy. Largely because I didn't know what I was missing. If you were to erase my memories of these licensed bargain bin games and make me play them for the first time as an adult, I'd probably curse you and everything you stand for. But to a young kid like me, the novelty of merely getting to make things happen on a TV screen with buttons was enough to make me a bit more forgiving. You're telling me that I get to walk around Jimmy Neutron's lab and play as mini Donkey Kong?
Okay.
Yes! I didn't care that there were about 12 polygons on screen and that the level design was kind of booty, or that some of these games were literally just 2 hours long. I was just excited to be playing video games and to have the time to play said video games. As a child, I didn't feel pressure to use my free time to do something productive. Free time was truly a time when I was just liberated and I felt like I could do anything I wanted to and not think about anything other than the fun that I was having. I was also better able to appreciate the games that I had because the options were far more limited. Growing up in Arizona, going outside was not always a good option. So the choices were watch TV, and if none of the 3 channels had anything that you felt like watching, fire up the Tesseract and play one of the 7 games that you own. Maybe read a book if you happen to have one that really interests you, or if it had pictures. Listen, I think we all took reading for granted as kids. It was so much simpler then. Nowadays, I'm so ridiculously overwhelmed with choices. You gotta choose if you wanna play a game, watch a show, or a movie, or hop on YouTube. If you're playing a game, you gotta choose which console, and then choose from dozens if not hundreds of games. If you're watching TV, you gotta choose from one of several streaming services, and then scroll endlessly until nothing catches your attention. It's often so overwhelming nowadays that I often revert to doom scrolling Twitter and Reddit. I'm telling you, I would have been much better off if I had just pulled weeds in Animal Crossing. Because of modern technology and the advent of the internet, it's also a lot easier to access older media, which means more options are available. Older consoles only had games made specifically for those consoles, but look at modern consoles and PC, and you have a constantly expanding list of games that you could potentially choose from. Not just stuff designed specifically for those platforms, but retro games and indie games and
hentai games.
And you know, these games pop up and they're cheaper, or they're full of nostalgia, or they're just full of creative and unique concepts, and they're just so tantalizing. With the passage of time, there are just more games in general in existence, and playing even 10% of all of the games that exist in the world and beating them is pretty much a fool's feat. It's impossible. As a kid whose only options were the games that I owned and occasionally getting a new game if I was on good behavior or it was my birthday or whatever, I knew these games like the back of my hand. Again, there were less options. Each new game was a goddamn event. Nothing else in my life mattered. I remember I woke up one day, my Theo had gotten me New Super Mario Bros. Wii as a gift, and it was just chilling on my nightstand next to the bed, and I got so excited. The entire day revolved around this game, and subsequently the weekend. It was pretty great. Nowadays, I'll just go to my local game shop, pick up a copy of Guardians of the Galaxy for the PS5, and it's like, nice. And then the game just kind of chills on my shelf for a few days or weeks until I remember that it's there and I'm like, oh, that's right, I did buy that game. I'd rather play Honey Pop. Another factor that makes gaming feel less magical is, well, simply the era that we live in. You look at games now, and they're almost on par with full-blown movies, so much so that a lot of games are trying to emulate film. But that's a different discussion. Games look incredible, and they keep doing all of these amazing things that if you were to show younger me, I would have melted. But compare this generation to the generation that came before, and all of a sudden, it doesn't seem quite as impressive. I was technically conscious and sentient in the 90s. I couldn't really remember my brief time there, but I can only imagine the insane, mind-blowing experience that would have been seeing Mario come out of this warp pipe in 3D for the very first time. Or going from this to this within the span of just a handful of years. Today, it almost feels like a lot of our tech has sort of plateaued, and the types of improvements that we're seeing to games do make them look better, but they're not quite as mind-blowing as the stuff that we saw in the 90s or even the early 2000s. Nowadays, the focus is on things like resolution, frame rate, RTX reflections, and loading times, all things that definitely enhance the experience of playing a game, but thus far, the current gen consoles have been out for well over a year, and we still have yet to see a game that truly feels next gen, at least in my opinion. Though some have definitely come close, like Ratchet & Clank, which, by the way, is another game that I bought day one and also found to be technically impressive and just amazing, but I didn't get very far before dropping it and then forgetting that it was a game in my collection. The Switch bringing console gaming to a portable device is pretty impressive, but the technology was pretty outdated when it came out, and it's having more and more issues the longer that it stays on the market. Hopefully we get a second Switch soon. Virtual reality is probably one of the most exciting and innovative things happening in gaming, but the market is still incredibly niche and expensive to get into, and it exists in a separate parallel dimension to traditional gaming. It's never going to replace traditional gaming, and it shouldn't. It's an entirely different animal. And who knows how long it's going to be until it goes completely mainstream and gets all the kinks worked out.
You'll play me for it?
Yeah, your little TV game thing. I bet I can beat your high score.
You think that you can beat my high score on my TV game thing?
Yeah, I think you're scared now.
You don't even know what it's called.
I don't need to know what it's called.
Part 3. Corporate Cynicism and the People Who Make Games. This is where the content warning from earlier comes into play. The feeling of the wow factor of gaming not really being as strong as it used to be is exacerbated by the fact that a lot of games feel derivative, which is something that you naturally run into with any form of media. So many games exist now that it's hard not to get the feeling of, hey, that looks familiar, this Uncharted game's kind of like Tomb Raider. Hey, this Tomb Raider game's kind of like Uncharted. Hey, this Star Wars game is kind of like Uncharted. This is like Breath of the Wild. This is the Dark Souls of platformers. Hey, it's like Crash Bandicoot. When it comes to gaming, pretty much any concept that can be done has likely already been done. You have a character, sometimes they jump, sometimes they don't jump, sometimes they have a gun, sometimes they're first person. If a game has climbing, it's Uncharted. If a game has jumping, it's Mario. If a game has grass, now it's Breath of the Wild. Once you've played a good handful of games, you're pretty much well equipped to know what to expect with most other games going forward. And coming up with original, brand new ideas is hard. Really hard. When it comes to indie games, that's absolutely where a lot of people would agree that the majority of creativity in the gaming industry lies. Major gaming companies focus a lot more on marketability and franchise games. They prioritize sequels to well-known series as opposed to creating brand new original IPs with original concepts. They look at statistics and data to figure out what's already done well, and the well-oiled corporate machine figures out what's less risky to make, what's more likely to make a profit, and they go in that direction. That's not to say that originality is completely dead within AAA studios, because we do get those occasional new games that take the world by surprise and receive unanimous praise, and some of the best games ever made are sequels to other well-known and well-beloved games. But innovation in the AAA gaming space doesn't really feel like it happens at the same rate that it once used to. And the longer you've been playing games, the less impressed you tend to be by things that you've already seen before. I mean, look at this here. This would have blown my mind as a 12-year-old, but because we've seen so many incredible looking games, I'm just sort of like, yeah, that's cool. Not that different from the last one I played. Immortals Fenyx Rising was a really fun game that I enjoyed quite a bit, but it also didn't really blow me away with anything that I didn't feel like I had already experienced. I mean, it has nice colors, it's pleasing to look at, character dialogue is pretty fun, environments are actually pretty gorgeous on the PS5, and I mean, look at this. But I felt this internal need to compare it to things that I had already experienced, and that limited me from enjoying the game as much as I felt like I could have. And that game that I internally compared this one to was...
Say the line, Bart!
This is like Breath of the Wild.
Yeah!
When you play game after game after game, you just come out of it with this feeling that you've seen everything. And that can take away your ability to just have an open mind and enjoy a game for what it is. But this also isn't necessarily exclusive to the current era of gaming. After all, in the 80s, we had a bajillion Mega Man sequels that were all basically the same game after all. But in today's gaming landscape, it feels like there's so much pressure for new games to push boundaries and be the next big thing that revolutionizes the industry. The Tomb Raider games are very solid third-person shooter adventure games, but that's kind of all they are. They don't exactly push the boundaries of gaming. I end up prioritizing games that are revered and beloved by the gaming community, and sequels to series that I care about very deeply. I feel like if I play any game that's rated anything less than an 8 out of 10 by most publications, I'm wasting precious time on a game that isn't going to do much for me aside from make me think about another game that I could have been playing. That's definitely not fair to games that aren't considered innovative by a large swath of the gaming community. It's a toxic mindset for sure, and it's a slap in the face to all the incredibly talented developers that are putting their heart and soul into a game that, while it doesn't push boundaries, is still a very fun, competent game that deserves attention. People who work on video games just want to make something good. They do it because they care about the industry, but at the same time, with online discussions of games being such a prominent thing, this pseudo-review culture can sadly do a lot to alter one's perceptions of the industry as a whole, and alter opinions and interests. Case in point, this is also why I feel a strange sense of guilt whenever I decide to revisit a game that I've already played through. And you know, that sense of guilt is really silly when, again, most people play games to have fun. Imagine that. And there's something inherently comforting about playing a game that you already know you love. Getting lost in a world that used to mean something to you and giving you a comforting sense of nostalgia. But if it isn't new, you're made to feel like you're playing it safe, and you're not experiencing whatever new mind-blowing game you have yet to check out. This is more of a personal thing, but I've always been pressured by my family to try new things. Sometimes I'd order the same thing from a restaurant, and I'd be shamed for it, which is just one example, but experiences like this traumatized me, and now I feel an innate desire to be able to say that I've played the thing that everybody else loves. I've seen all the movies that everybody else considers to be worth watching. I've listened to every song that's good. But sometimes I just want to embrace my nostalgia and return to a happy place, to feel like I'm in control of something in my life, where lately I've been feeling like everything is out of my control and is spiraling into doom. But speaking of nostalgia, that's another source of criticism with the larger gaming landscape. With the industry at large focusing on creating sequels and remaking or reimagining beloved games, in the process they allocate resources to those projects that fans would have much rather seen be put to use on brand new games, especially brand new intellectual properties, which are a lot harder to come by these days. Rockstar Games is kind of notorious in this department. They were putting out so many games in the PS2 OG Xbox era, but now in the current gen, they've released the same GTA on 3 different generations generations of console, and made a sequel to a game from the 7th gen. They also half-assed ports of 3 of their classic games. This is just one example, but I think it illustrates my point well. Granted, games of the scale that Rockstar works at tend to be much larger projects that take longer to complete, but when we've been playing the exact same game since 2013, with still no official news of a sequel in sight, and when the game continues to reappear at the top of sales charts, the business strategy makes a whole lot of sense. Unfortunately, this leaves the fans wanting something more and not really getting it. Indie games, once again, do show up and help to pick up the slack, and they're often free from corporate overlords seeking profits over creativity, but the right ones can be hard to find, and with smaller teams and less resources, it can take a lot more time for a game to be released. Silksong and the Cuphead DLC are just a few examples in this department. Indie games are becoming more of a powerhouse, and what a single person is capable of creating nowadays is leaps and bounds beyond what was possible just a couple generations ago. Though gamers are naturally going to have a bias for full-priced $60 or $70 games, and they want those games to feel fresh and like they're at the cutting edge of technology. This holds especially true for anybody who bought a current-gen console like the PS5 or Xbox Series X. Or perhaps somebody who got their hands on one of those newfangled RTX 30 series gapoos. Gamers want to feel like they're getting the most out of their platform of choice by playing the most graphically intensive, big budget games. Unless the game is in 2D, in which case, get it out of here. This desire to be at the forefront of cutting edge technology means a lot of games strive to achieve realism, and while realistic graphics can be mind-blowing, it feels like every generation touts its realistic graphics, and we've already come so close. The more games try to look gritty and realistic, the more it runs the risk of being forgettable and not having a distinct art style that sticks with people. Realistic games also tend to not age as well as games with unique art styles and strong art direction. Listen, how many games have you played with character designs that look like this? A game like Deathloop has a more realistic art style, but thanks to its UI design and a little bit of stylization, it sticks out in my memory as a game that I'm probably not going to forget. Actually, that's a lie. I totally forgot about this game until I randomly decided to bring it up here. As someone who lives in a real world that's constantly letting me down and filling me with despair, I want more than anything for my gaming experience to be an escape from that world. Sometimes I'm just not in the mood for something that's going to make me depressed, or think hard about the human condition and my own mortality or whatever. Sometimes I just want a cute little house on the beach. Much like with the film industry, the gaming industry runs rampant with remakes, reboots, and sequels. But I'd be lying if name recognition didn't matter when it came to getting my interest in a series. You slap Zelda on the title of a game, and I will be there. Even if it's a Musou-style game, which is one of my least favorite kinds of games. Notoriously, Star Fox Adventures, previously known as Dinosaur Planet during early development, was originally supposed to be an original game with original characters, until Mario's dad Shiggy told Rareware that they should make it into a Star Fox game. It definitely helped in the sales department, but fans were also disappointed because it tried to be something that it was never originally designed to be, and though it does have its fans, it's not exactly fondly remembered. Everyone remembers Crystal, though. But because Fox McCloud is in this game, it has more of a legacy than it likely would have had if it were just Dinosaur Planet. With the gaming industry eclipsing the film industry in terms of how much money it makes, we also see a lot of companies focusing more on profits at the expense of creatives who just want to develop games. Crunch culture is a big thing in the gaming industry, and hearing about this time and time again is disheartening, especially when it exists alongside companies like Activision Blizzard, one of the worst offenders with regards to the well-being of their employees, as they've allowed toxic work environments rampant with sexism and sexual harassment. Studios like Naughty Dog, Bungie, Rockstar, and many more have all been accused of crunch culture. This type of work environment isn't exclusive to gaming, but it's a common issue in the industry, and because of the internet, consumers are more aware of when companies engage in horrible practices. It's disheartening to know that passionate and talented creators are being treated like garbage, and as a consumer who spends money on the games made in these conditions, it's hard not to feel some degree of responsibility. Within certain parts of gaming communities, there's also an entitled toxicity with many consumers who are vocal and will lose their minds when a game is delayed, encouraging companies to engage in these practices. Also, stockholders. Time and time again, it's been shown that when companies look out for the well-being of their employees, not only are they more productive, but the games come out better. This doesn't really seem to be the norm though, and time again we hear about games coming out unfinished or failing to live up to expectations. Everyone remembers Cyberpunk 2077 and how infamously broken the game was at release. By all accounts, it's widely regarded as a great game, but its legacy shall forever be the shit show that was its messy and buggy release. And this type of corporate cynicism sadly detracts from the childlike wonder of anticipating a brand new game and playing the living shit out of it. But then there are those times when things get personal. When you have to carefully consider whether you're okay with supporting someone who has allowed harm to come to others or even to yourself and those around you, that makes a huge difference in the experience of playing and enjoying games. I get that in cases like the one with J.K. Rowling and Hogwarts Legacy, other people work on these projects, and reportedly Rowling has already been paid licensing fees. By no means should a consumer ever feel shame for wanting to engage with media that happened to come from a problematic creator. Many are unaffected by Rowling's turfy statements or outright agree with her, while others are directly affected by her words and her rhetoric. But the IP of Harry Potter means so much to them that they look at the situation and say, you know, she's gonna be rich and throw me under the bus no matter what. I might as well get that game and at least play something that takes me back to my happy place. But at the same time, a lot of others don't want to be intrinsically linked to the profits of a person who's contributing to their lives being far more difficult. And that's another harsh reality of becoming an adult. It's being more conscious about the people making the products you consume and having to factor that into your decision. Nothing exists in a vacuum. When you're playing through a game and you're pulled out of the experience by a constant reminder that this fantastical world that you're existing in was envisioned by a person who hates you for merely existing, that pulls you out of the magic. And that really sucks.
Did you see the latest Nintendo newsletter?
Whoa, nice graphics. I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System.
Part 4. How gaming has changed. The way gaming has evolved has made it so that certain aspects of the gaming experience are no longer present. Local split-screen multiplayer with friends, going to a store to buy your games physically, reading the game's manual on the car ride home, cheat codes, not having to install day one patches, and the list goes on and on. These are, again, byproducts of companies trying to maximize profits. Getting a thick manual is cool, but most people don't read those. Cheat codes are cool, but why add that in for free when we can just sell you DLC? We could release a finished game in February, but we'd rather sell you a broken game in December so we can get those Christmas sales, and then just fix the game later on with patches. Who cares if it's detrimental to your initial experience playing a game, which is the experience that you'll probably remember the most. As games become more expensive to develop and produce, and as inflation is also a thing, we see alternate methods of monetization come into play, namely in the form of paid DLC and expansions. But also, as consumers crave more and more, companies feel the need to justify charging full price for a game. If a game is any shorter than 12 hours long, buttloads of gamers will claim that they've been ripped off and that their hard-earned money went down the drain. So companies feel incentivized to make their games longer, a lot longer, and they want to figure out how to do this as efficiently and cost-effectively as possible. But what this often means is taking a game that's normally 15 hours long and loading it up with 50 hours of bland and repetitive content. This isn't the case with every game that has playtimes reaching into the triple digits, but it's common enough that it leads to the Ubisoft open world problem, where it feels like so many games want to be open world games. And games that are open world often rely on bombarding you with menial tasks in the hopes of keeping you occupied. Suffice it to say, these tasks hurt the overall experience, as you end up spending most of your time in the game's world grinding and doing busy work. Games like Breath of the Wild have taken strides to correct many of these issues, but we still see games being flooded with content for the sake of content. So many of the biggest games tend to be either open world games or RPGs or both. I had a hard time getting into JRPGs in particular, but Persona 5 really clicked with me. Not so much because of the battle mechanics, which I found myself liking more than most turn-based battle mechanics, but still wasn't crazy about, but because I fell in love with the life sim stuff. Probably because my own high school experience kind of sucked ass. So it was nice having a way to live vicariously through fantasy high school with demon Pokemans. The problem with the game this immersive is that beating the game takes close to 100 hours. Sometimes even more than that depending on the way that you play the game. And just a few months after my initial playthrough, Persona 5 Royal came out, basically being an enhanced and improved version of the original game with extra content. Occasional moments of grindy battles and uninteresting dialogue aside, I loved that experience just as much, if not more, than my initial P5 experience. But because of how much content is jam-packed into this game, it pretty much took over any and all free time that I had for a solid 4 months at least. All of a sudden, I feel like I'm wasting time that I could be spending on a smaller game like Celeste, or Shovel Knight, or Hollow Knight, or Fortnite. Wanting games to be longer makes sense from a value perspective, but for people who have limited free time and other commitments, these types of games just aren't feasible. I used a bunch of exploits and played on an easier difficulty, and fast-forwarded through a lot of the game's dialogue, particularly during my playthrough of Royal. And that definitely shaved a few hours off of my playthrough, but I still spent a ridiculous amount of time playing a single video game. And while I was happy to be done with it, getting back to one of the issues we mentioned earlier, I didn't play the game the way it was technically intended to be played. But, you know, who cares? Everyone should be encouraged to play games the way that they want to, but even I wasn't entirely immune to this strange guilt and gatekeepiness that exists within all fandoms. A lot of longer games absolutely justify their length, Persona 5 being among them. But playing games like that these days just isn't feasible for me as an adult. I've played so many games over the years that I'm picky about what I decide to spend my time with, and having hundreds of games to choose from across multiple platforms is not conducive to making good decisions. It gets even worse when you factor in services like Xbox Game Pass or PS Now. My god, how does anyone decide what they want to play when they subscribe to these services? There's too many games. What, you're telling me people actually have time to take advantage of these services?
Today I was like, let's redecorate the house.
And I was like, maybe we should buy some furniture first.
Nice outfit. Where'd you get it? A garbage dump? Yeah.
Part 5. Mental Health. For the final section, discussing why gaming doesn't feel like it used to, I want to talk a bit again about Super Mario Odyssey, because I think this game in particular signified a big turning point for me personally. All of the previously listed factors so far were true, but it was exacerbated and made worse by the game's design not meshing with where I was at that point in time, despite it being exactly the kind of game that I had been clamoring for since 2010. I was still the same person, of course, but I had fundamentally changed. No longer as an adult do I feel fulfilled by simply platforming for the sake of platforming, or action for action's sake, at least not when I have so much going on beyond the game itself. With the games that I play, I need to feel a sense of progression, like each thing I do in the game is contributing to an overarching goal, mirroring my goal-oriented way of looking at my own life. The problem with Super Mario Odyssey is that it's really open-ended and, in all honesty, not very difficult up until you get to the post-game stuff. The truly interesting challenges come after you beat the final boss and the credits roll. Some would say that this is where the game truly begins, a trend that has been pretty common in a lot of the more recent Mario games. But this style of game design leaves me completely unfulfilled by all of the stuff that comes after the credits, because subconsciously I feel like I have nothing more to work towards. The stuff that is considered the main game is the stuff that I consider to be the most important, and if it's more underwhelming, then I end up not feeling quite as satisfied. 100% completion in this specific game is unnecessarily complicated, and I also just generally don't go for it. Why did everything shift so drastically? In more recent years, it seems to have clicked for me. When I was a kid, gaming was everything. There was nothing else I'd rather be doing if free time allowed for it. But my parental figures would always encourage me to go outside, and they'd berate me for liking video games as much as I did. That's pretty normal for most parents, but as I got older, entered middle school and then high school, I was known within my immediate family as the one who's obsessed with video games, and sure enough, that stuck around as my identity. I had other passions and interests, of course, namely learning how to play the piano, which Nintendo music was kind of my gateway to that. None of that really did much to help this stigma and this perception that my family had for me. They would talk about my cool talents and interests around strangers and family friends, but amongst each other or extended family, they'd sort of look down upon me. Oh, that silly JJ wasting your time with video games, tisk tisk. I would always be encouraged to do literally anything other than playing video games. And years of getting this constant feedback from the people around you starts to get to you. It was ingrained into my brain, the idea that if I wanted to be taken seriously, to be more mature, and to succeed in all other aspects of my life, I would need to distance myself from gaming. It was childish, especially since I played Mario games on my Wii instead of joining a sports team and making friends and going out to parties and stuff. Because I stuck with Nintendo, which before the Switch wasn't really taken very seriously, the stigma of being a Nintendo kid and playing on the Wii made it difficult to find other friends with similar interests. Like, wow, not only do I spend so much of my time playing video games, but I play these kiddie Mario games. Eventually, a day came around where my Wii broke because it wasn't reading discs anymore, and I had to put gaming aside for a while. During that time, I got really into anime, which helped me to find a niche group of friends at my new high school, and it filled the gaming-related void that resulted from me not having any kind of home console. But that too was seen as childish. To my brother, these were weird, goofy, sometimes horny cartoons. To my mom, they were childish and satanic because they came from a country where Christianity isn't the most prominent religion. Okay. Point is, no matter what my interests were, if they were escapist or bright and colorful or related to any kind of media consumption, I was looked down upon for having them. So when I left for college, I did my best to distance myself from these interests. I felt ashamed of what I used to love, and like I should be focusing more on my adult life, on things that actually matter. What mattered to me more now was my social life, my ability to financially support myself, and to take care of my partner who I met freshman year of college. I grew up, and the things that I considered important changed. But at the same time, I found myself longing for those carefree days, getting lost in virtual worlds and going on adventures. But after pushing them aside, when I came back to them, they just weren't fulfilling me in the exact same ways that they used to. And I think the primary reason for that is the roadblock of my own brain telling me you shouldn't be liking this as much as you do. You see, we tend to heavily stigmatize escapism. We devalue media and the act of simply taking time for yourself. In the US, there's a work culture that emphasizes the grind, and that pushes people to feel like they're wasting their time if they're simply taking a break, especially if they're a younger person who needs to save up for retirement and a house and other things that boomers had a much easier time getting. You're supposed to work your ass off now so that when you're older and your youth has passed you by, you can finally take some time for yourself. For a lot of us, taking a break is something that we just can't afford to do right now, at least not very often. I could go back and play my favorite games, but they weren't exactly going to help me save up for a car or improve my university grades or give me marketing skills that would be necessary for me being able to find a job. I thought, if my parents could see me right now and saw that I was playing video games instead of getting ahead on my work, they'd be disappointed in me. If they were here right now, they'd be telling me to grow up and stop living in the past. Nothing's changed. You haven't grown up or matured at all. This stigma, combined with some personal experiences that I don't want to get into, resulted in me having some pretty intense depression. Depression that I did my best to push down and repress, but nevertheless a depression that was present in my life and made enjoying anything a lot more difficult. Whether it be a nice meal or going to the movies or just having fun with friends, any moment of joy or pleasure in my life was something that I felt this weird pressure with. I had a bit of an existential crisis, and in that, I'd try to cherish the few moments of respite that I could find, but thinking about how fleeting the moment was, I felt so much pressure to make the most out of each moment. And whatever time I did have for myself, I wasn't really enjoying it as much as I could because the whole time I was worried about the fact that it was eventually going to end. I was thinking about what comes next. I would second guess myself no matter what I did and wonder if I truly did use that hour wisely, almost always feeling like I had wasted it. This weighed me down each and every time I had a moment to do something for myself, especially when it came to contemplating whether or not I wanted to play video games. because at any given moment, there were always dozens of supposed more productive things that I felt like I could and should be doing. Things that would make me a more valued contributor to society. But none of that falls on the gaming industry, nor anyone who creates media for the consumption of others. The problem lay with my mental health, with external factors, and with how stigmatized mental health can be, meaning I'd shove it to the back of my mind and try to deny that there was ever anything there that needed to be addressed. And then 2020 happened, and things got worse for everyone. Like everyone, I felt some intense despair after dealing with a lot of things, like losing people that I once cared for, and the loss of things that I once thought I could look forward to. But during this time, I had some self-reflection, and I realized that I needed to do something about this. I finally took the plunge and set up a therapy appointment after graduating. Getting help to address the deeper personal issues that were bringing me down and being told, hey, it's okay to enjoy the things that you like. It's important to keep those things in your life and to make time for them. Hearing it's okay to be yourself and to just like what you like, it really made a difference. And after enough sessions, I think I finally figured out a pretty good way to move forward.
What? Is that it?
Closing thoughts. How do we move forward? So I'm not gonna lie and pretend that therapy fixed everything, but it definitely made a huge difference and gave me a lot of the tools that I needed to move forward. Prioritizing one's mental health is very important. I know that this video is specifically about gaming burnout, and I spent a lot of time talking about mental health, but I think the two are largely intertwined, and I think that many of the people who experience this type of burnout or lack of passion with regards to gaming, these people might be experiencing something similar to what I did. If that's not the case and you find yourself constantly buying games that end up not being played and just clogging up your backlog, well, I think I still have some ways that I can help you out. There are a lot of practices and things intrinsic to the industry that we can't really change. Though voting with our wallets does give us some degree of power, but typically not enough to overhaul the entire thing. Things will also never be the same as they were when we were children. But with that being said, you can still have fun as an adult, and I believe it's possible to recapture some of that magic. So what I'm about to present to you are a few practical tips that have, in my experience, gotten me to a point of feeling like I've recaptured some of the magic that gaming used to once bring me in my childhood. This is all anecdotal, based on conjecture and my personal experiences, but I think there's got to be at least something in here that should help you out. My very first tip is for people who have a backlog, and if so, try to prevent it from getting any bigger, cutting off a lot of the problem at its source. Many times I've made impulse purchases on things I thought that I might like, only to regret my purchase. Typically, these are newer games that I pay full price for, and then several months or even years later down the line, they go on sale, and at most I've put an hour or less into that game, assuming I ever even installed it and played it in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy new games until you're done with your backlog, but I do recommend keeping brand new games that you buy to the kinds of games that you actively care about or give priority to. For me, these new games are typically reserved for installments of long-running series that I play every single game in. If you're even remotely on the fence about buying something, wait until the hype has died down and it goes on sale, then assess your interest level at that point. If you're not ready to hop into a game's world the moment that you buy it, I wouldn't recommend that purchase, especially since a lot of my own impulse buys came from the conversation surrounding a lot of new games. There will always be more sales if you don't get it the first time around, and the longer you wait, the cheaper it's likely going to become over time. If you keep pushing it off at this point, then that might be a good sign that you avoided spending money on something that would end up rotting on your shelf or would sit alone sadly in your digital library. Speaking of a digital library, be careful with sales. A lot of impulse purchases can come from sales, which happen seasonally on pretty much every major platform. And if you are going into a sale ready to pick up a few things, then I recommend setting a budget, especially if your backlog is already massive. Now, this depends on the person, as there are collectors whose goal is to own literally every game that exists for a certain platform, and if that's the case, then yeah, if you see something, go for it. But for people who aren't collectors and who do struggle with figuring out when to play games and what games they even want to play, limiting your options is always a good thing. Another thing is that I tend to have more regrets when I download games that I'm not so sure about. Once you download a game, you're kind of stuck with it. I get that on PC and certain variants of the PS5 and Xbox One, you're only only option is digital, but if you have the option to get something physically, I would say to do that for any game that isn't a must-buy or something that you plan on playing frequently. At least then, if you don't like it, you can turn around and resell it, clearing it out of your library. Luckily, Steam does have a pretty lenient return policy that allows you to return games that you've only played for less than 2 hours. So take advantage of that if you get to the 1.5 hour mark and a game is still not quite clicking with you. Otherwise, yes, try to keep your digital library from getting too big, because this digital library is always going to come back around to mock you. I recommend uninstalling everything on your console, leaving only around 3 to 5 games. These are the titles that I treat as my immediate queue of sorts, and having just a handful of games to focus on at any given time keeps me a bit more focused and makes the whole process feel a little less overwhelming. The way I go about doing this is I picked from different categories. So for instance, the first game would be long games, big expansive RPGs, open world adventures, anything with a runtime of 40 hours or more, or something that requires a lot of attention and focus. The second game is a much smaller, less complicated game. Could still be something AAA, but it's something that's a little more focused on raw action. Something that you would be able to jump into even if you went weeks and weeks without playing it. That way you wouldn't feel completely lost hopping back into the game. It's especially helpful if it's something that contrasts the first game. For this category, platformers and action-heavy games work pretty good. The third option is kind of a wild card and depends on your taste. Typically, I like to designate this category for people who play online games with friends. If you're able to keep your queue to just 3 games, great, but I get that for some, this is a lot more difficult, especially if you have multiple consoles. If you do game on other platforms, designating 3 games per platform is a good way to go about things in my opinion. I mean, it's still a lot of options, but it's a lot more concise and focused. If the bulk of your gaming is done on a single platform and you're very active on that platform, I would say that you can probably go up to about 4, maybe even 5 games, though I wouldn't exceed 5 if I could help it. Just make sure that you don't play too many games of the same type or genre back to back, unless that's something that you really like to do. But for most people, this can very quickly and easily lead to burnout, so it's always good to switch between big, complex, mega, big, thinky game and smaller, fun, chill, relaxing game. By limiting the amount of games available to play at any given time, you cut down on decision fatigue, which is one of the areas that I struggle with the most. Listen, we've all had that moment of trying to figure out what we want to eat, and then we ask the person next to us what they want to eat, and they have no idea, so they ask you, and it's this constant back and forth, and you just keep saying, I don't know. And then an hour goes by and you just die from malnutrition. Yeah, we've all been there. Less options means less stress. And the good thing is that you still have access to all of the other games in your library. You can swap games in and out whenever you want, but you'll be less inclined to try and swap things out because you're going to have to go through the lengthy install process. A nice deterrent, as I like to call it. This method's not going to work for everyone since a lot of people just want to have access to whatever games they're going to play when they want to play them, and fair enough. I feel like I need to justify the 128 gig SD card that's installed right on my system. That's chunky, look at all these games. And of course, games that are an exception to this are games with local multiplayer, things that you want to have around on your system at all times in case people want to play a game with you, especially when it comes to the Switch, which is full of party games. I also think that that's where folder and organization systems come into play, particularly with the Switch's folder setup. Everything's nicely organized and the choices aren't as overwhelming this way. I wish everybody had a really good folder system. Even Nintendo's is kind of not the best. On PS5, I also like to hide games that I know for a fact I'm never going to play again. On the off chance that I ever do, for some reason, want to revisit that game, I still own it and it's still there. I just have to dig around a little harder to get to it. When your collection starts to get dummy thick, it's best to clear these out of sight. This is the same philosophy as throwing shit under your bed. I mean, it doesn't get rid of all the shit that's there, but I mean, the room looks nicer. I'd also recommend adding things like TV shows and reading to your rotation. Taking regular breaks from gaming to engage with other media and taking breaks from that other media to sometimes play games. I have a lot of interests that include watching TV shows, playing video games, making YouTube videos, and reading books. I have to actively try and make time for all of these things, otherwise they're not going to happen. For as much as I love reading, I end up not doing it nearly as much as I wish I did. So try to allocate some time for all of these things. If none of this works and you're still really indecisive or it's really hard to stick to the 3 to 5 system, then I don't know, maybe try a randomizer and leave it up to chance. Having a computer tell you what to do or tell you what to eat or what to read can be pretty helpful. Don't be afraid to drop a game if it just isn't clicking for you. Depending on the game, if you get to the 3-hour mark and you're still not having a good time, then just delete it, and maybe come back to it another time if you ever feel the urge to do so. The exception in this case would be games that notoriously have slower, lengthy tutorials and are slow to start in general. But hey, you know what you like. And if you feel like you need something that gets you into the action faster, then just play the game that gives you that action. Nobody should ever have to feel guilt over having a backlog. I feel like most people who play video games have a decent backlog, especially if they have services like PS Plus, PS Now, Xbox Game Pass, or whatever dozens of other services are out there that give you a large collection of games. It's just part of the gaming experience, and you should just play whatever you feel inclined to play. Even if that means revisiting a game that you've already beaten 12 times, the backlog is not the be-all end-all to gaming. Playing the game that you want to play right now instead of worrying about the backlog is probably going to do a lot more for you in the long run. If you really do want to clear the backlog, then finding ways to reward yourself for beating a game could also be a nice way to build positive associations. I'd hesitate to treat gaming like an obligation, but again, it's good to allocate time to just play video games and do other things that bring you joy. Of course, your other real-life obligations take priority, but make sure you give yourself some gaming time. Accept the fact that you're never going to 100% clear your backlog. There will always be at least a few games in there, no matter how good you are at optimizing your ability to conquer whatever's there. That's okay. You don't need to feel any shame for that. I guarantee you, all of your other friends who play video games probably have a pretty big backlog too. Speaking of feeling unnecessary shame for things, if you're playing RPG mixed sword game and you're tired of all the grinding, it's okay to switch the game to easy mode, or use whatever exploit helps you get a bunch of XP, or just pay Billy from down the street to grind for you for a few hours. No one has the right to tell you how you should be playing video games. If skipping ahead in Animal Crossing works better for your lifestyle and your schedule, then do it. As long as you can get the most out of whatever game you're playing, you should be able to do that thing. The same goes for modding, emulation, using a DDR controller to play Elden Ring, I don't fucking know. Whatever gives you the most fun and most fulfillment from playing a video game. If you're somebody who's worried about what other people think about the way that you play video games, well, you have my permission to do whatever the fuck you want. Within legal reason, of course. And the last tip that I have is go to therapy. Listen, I know I talked a lot about mental health in that one section already, but if none of these tips are particularly helping, then you might have some underlying mental health issues that make things harder. And that's okay. Therapy is something that I recommend not just to people who are struggling with mental health issues, but I recommend it to anyone and everyone. There is no shame in going to therapy or looking out for your mental health. And so long as you find a therapist that suits your needs, I'd say that you should make this a priority. But hey, I'm not a doctor. I don't control your life. You do you, buddy. So there we go. After 3 hours of recorded audio, my throat is feeling pretty dry, but that's all of my advice. To lose my ability to enjoy this outlet was terrifying. But not only is reconnecting with media that you love worth doing, it's necessary. The art that we human beings create, whether it be films, novels, paintings, music, or video games, are a distinct part of what makes us human. So I think it's about time we embrace our humanity and help each other to get the most fulfillment out of art. Listen, I'm not a professional anything, but I can speak from my own personal experiences, and as somebody who's lived through the experience of thinking that I no longer enjoyed video games and freaking out about it, I can assure you that these tips have helped me out a lot. If I was able to help you in any capacity, then I'm really happy to hear it. If you have any other tips or things in general that you do to help with any of the issues that I talked about earlier in this video, please share them in the comments below. I promise I will go down there and check them out. And no matter what, please take some time for yourself and play a game, watch a fun movie, have a little snack. Just treat yourself the way that you deserve to be treated. And with that, thank you for coming to my hour-long therapy session. Have a great day. Okay, is the camera off? Huh? Oh, you're talking about this thing. It just kind of appeared out of nowhere. I think it might be alive? I can't say for sure. Well, I'll make sure to take good care of it until something happens. Come on. Do something. Well, I'm bored. I'm gonna go get some void pizza. Never say that to me again. All right, what kind of toppings do you want? We got sausage, pepperoni. Hello, and welcome to yet another outro because I pulled a Return of the King and we're still going. This channel has seen a lot of growth over the last few weeks that I honestly never expected to happen. It makes me really happy to know that so many of you are watching and enjoying the content that I make. For those of you who might be interested, I wanted to let you know that we have a Discord server now. The Zillennial Dissonance Discord server is just a cool place to hang out, talk about video games, movies, TV shows, just whatever you're in the mood for. We also have a Zillennial Dissonance Twitter, where on occasion I'll make a banger tweet or two, probably like once every couple months or so. But if you're interested in checking that out, then there's that. The final thing I wanted to announce is that we have a Patreon now. With enough financial support, I would be able to dedicate a lot more time to YouTube, and thus I'd be able to make content a lot more frequently. And if you'd like to help make that a reality, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description down below. Thanks again to each and every subscriber and viewer who helped to get the channel up to 1,000 subscribers and counting. Reading your comments and knowing that you enjoy the stuff I make has brought me an insane amount of joy, and again, I can't wait to share what else I'm working on right now. I'll catch everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.